So the old man finally decided to stay home and let the professionals handle things, my son-in-law said, loud enough for the whole Thanksgiving table to hear. He was grinning. That particular grin, the one that never quite reached his eyes, had been aimed at me more times than I could count over the past 3 years. I set down my fork. I looked at him across the table. Past the cranberry sauce and the carved turkey and my daughter Fiona's frozen smile. Past my grandson's wide eyes. Past my son-in-law's mother, who was pretending to be very interested in her mashed potatoes. Actually, Spencer, I said, keeping my voice completely calm, I've been meaning to talk to you about that. About what happened at the cabin. All of it. The grin didn't disappear. But something shifted behind his eyes. He had no idea what I'd found up there. Let me back up. My name is Walter. No, wait. My name is Roger. Roger Callum. I'm 64 years old, a retired structural engineer with 31 years at a firm in Hamilton, Ontario. I know how things are built. More importantly, I know how things fail. I spent 3 decades figuring out why structures collapse, why joints give way, why what looks solid from the outside is hollow and dangerous underneath. That knowledge, it turns out, applies to more than just buildings. My wife, Carol, passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless, the way that disease tends to be. We had 36 years together, and I won't pretend the ones after were easy. The house in Hamilton felt too big. The silence had a particular weight to it that I hadn't expected. I started driving just to have somewhere to go. Our daughter Fiona was the thing that kept me anchored. She lives in Mississauga with her husband Spencer and their boy, Callum, who just turned 7. I made the drive out every second weekend. I kept my hands busy doing repairs around their house, recaulking the bathroom, replacing a rotted deck board, fixing the kitchen tap that Spencer had been meaning to get to for 8 months. Small things. Things that mattered. Spencer Holt. Where to begin? He was 38, worked in pharmaceutical sales, made good money, and spent most of it on the image of making good money. Leased truck every 2 years. Hockey tickets. Golf club membership in Oakville. He was the kind of man who shook your hand while already looking past your shoulder. From the first time Fiona brought him home for dinner, something about him sat wrong with me. I couldn't name it then. I thought it was just the protective instinct of a father who'd never quite be ready to hand his daughter over to anyone. But it wasn't that. It was that he looked at people, at me specifically, the way you look at furniture. Useful when you need it. Invisible otherwise. The comment started small. Roger's getting a bit slow on that ladder, isn't he, Fi? Said to my daughter while I was still in earshot, changing a burned-out floodlight in their backyard. Or at Callum's birthday party last spring, Grandpa Roger still thinks it's 1985 out there. Laughing, like it was a joke. Always framed as a joke. Fiona would give me that look, apologetic, tired, caught between the two of us. I never said anything. Carol would have told me to say something. She had that directness I always admired and only sometimes envied. But I kept quiet, because I didn't want to put Fiona in the middle, and because I genuinely believed, for longer than I should have, that Spencer was harmless. Thoughtless, maybe. A bit of a bully in the casual way some men are bullies without thinking of themselves that way. But harmless. The cabin changed my thinking on that. I owned a property up near Parry Sound, about 2.5 hours north of Mississauga on Highway 400. 40 acres on a lake, with a one-room cabin I'd built with my own hands the summer Fiona was 12. It wasn't fancy. Wood stove, propane cooktop, no running water until I ran a line from the lake pump. But I loved that place the way you love something you made yourself. In September, 2 months before Thanksgiving, Spencer came to me with a proposition. He wanted to take a few of his colleagues from work up to the cabin for a long weekend. A fishing trip, he said. Client entertainment. 4 men, 3 nights. He'd pay for all the supplies and leave the place cleaner than they found it. I said no. I said it politely. I told him the cabin wasn't really set up for groups, that I'd been planning to go up myself in October for some maintenance work, and that I'd rather keep that particular weekend free. All of which was true. He nodded. He said he understood completely. He said, "No worries at all, Roger. I get it." 2 weeks later he asked Fiona to ask me. I told Fiona the same thing. A few days after that, she called me again, sounding tired in a way that made me wonder what the conversation at home had looked like. I held my ground. The answer was no. October came. I drove up to the cabin on a Thursday morning, the truck loaded with a new pressure valve for the pump, weather stripping for the door, and enough firewood to see out the weekend. The drive up was fine. The leaves were going, all that orange and red that makes the shield look like it's on fire, and I had the radio on and a thermos of coffee, and I was feeling, for the first time in months, genuinely at peace. I pulled off the main road onto the gravel track that winds through the spruce for about 1.5 kilometers before the cabin comes into view. The track was muddy from a recent rain. The truck slipped a little on the corners. I took it slow. The cabin looked fine from the outside. I didn't notice anything wrong until I opened the front door. The place had been used. Not broken into, I couldn't see any damage to the lock. But used. The ash in the wood stove was fresh, 3 or 4 days old at most. There were beer bottles in the recycling bin. Someone had moved the chairs around and not put them back. The propane gauge read lower than I'd left it. Spencer had taken his trip anyway. Without my permission. With a key I'd never given him, which meant he'd either copied mine or found the spare I kept in the shed under the kayak. I stood in the middle of that cabin for a long time. I'm not a man who loses his temper quickly. It's not virtue, it's just how I'm wired. I get cold instead of hot. I went outside and walked the property, checking things the way I always do when I arrive: the pump housing, the dock, the generator shed. Everything looked fine until I got to the dock. 2 of the cross braces underneath the main deck had been cut. Not broken. Not rotted through. Cut. Clean diagonal cuts through the treated lumber, not all the way through, just enough that the dock would hold weight for a while, and then give way. I crouched down there for a long time, looking at those cuts. I knew that kind of cut. I'd seen what it could do. A dock gives way when someone's standing on it, they go into the water. In October, that water is 8 or 9 degrees Celsius. You've got maybe 10 minutes before your muscles stop cooperating. The lake is deep out past the dock. No neighbors visible from where I stood. The nearest property was about 4 kilometers by road. I thought about who had been at this cabin 3 or 4 days ago. Then I went back inside and I sat down and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do. I did not call the police. Not yet. Not because I wasn't sure, I was sure, in the way you're sure about structural failures when you've seen enough of them, but because I needed more than cut lumber. Anyone could have cut those boards. I needed something that placed Spencer specifically at the scene, doing something that couldn't be explained away as an accident or a misunderstanding or someone else's doing. I needed a pattern, not an incident. I also needed to understand the why. Which meant I needed to look harder at some things I'd been deliberately not looking at for the past 2 years. I went back to Hamilton that evening. I called my accountant, Don Price, who's been handling my finances since before Fiona was born. I asked him about my estate documents, who was listed as beneficiary on my life insurance policy. He told me my policy still listed Carol as primary, with Fiona as contingent. That hadn't been updated since Carol died. Then I asked him to check something else. A few weeks earlier I'd received paperwork in the mail that I'd signed and returned without reading carefully enough, something Spencer had described as a routine update to my investment account that he'd been helping a colleague's client with. I'd been distracted. I'd trusted him because he was family. Don called me back the next morning. The paperwork I'd signed had been used to request a change of beneficiary on one of my registered accounts. The new primary beneficiary was Spencer Holt. I sat down. I looked out the window at my backyard, Carol's garden, which I still tended the way she'd taught me. Spencer had tried to kill me. Or rather, he'd positioned things so that if I fell off a dock in October and drowned, he'd be the primary beneficiary on a registered account worth about $380,000. And he'd done it while Fiona was his wife, which meant he controlled where that money went within the household regardless of whether her name was on it. This was not a man who'd made a stupid mistake. This was a man who'd been thinking. I spent the next 3 weeks being very careful and very quiet. I drove back up to the cabin with my camera and documented everything, the dock, the cuts, the angles, close-up photographs that showed clearly this was tool work and not rot or weather damage. I measured the depth and angle of each cut and noted it in writing, signed and dated. I retrieved the beer bottles from the recycling bin and put them in a bag. I found a receipt someone had dropped behind the couch, Quickie gas station on the 69, dated the Saturday of the weekend in question. I hired a private investigator in Mississauga named Ben Willett, who came recommended by a former colleague. I told him what I suspected and what I needed documented. He was thorough and discreet and didn't ask me more questions than he needed to. I also met, privately, with a lawyer named Catherine Marsh, whose office is on King Street in Hamilton. I walked her through everything. She listened without interrupting, asked precise questions, and when I finished she said, "You've done this correctly so far. Let's make sure you keep doing it correctly." Then she told me something that surprised me. She said the change of beneficiary I'd signed was likely invalid because my signature had been obtained under false pretenses. The document had been described to me as something it wasn't. That could be challenged. But more importantly, she said, the dock sabotage, combined with the fraudulent beneficiary change, gave us something that looked very much like attempted murder for financial gain. That's an RCMP matter, she said. I asked her to give me until after Thanksgiving. I had a reason for that. Spencer had mentioned Thanksgiving 3 times in October. Fiona was hosting. His parents were coming, his mother Ruth and his father Glenn, whom I'd met twice and found perfectly decent. My sister June and her husband Paul were also invited. And me, of course. The whole family together. I wanted Spencer comfortable. I wanted him relaxed and competent and in a room full of witnesses when things stopped going the way he'd planned. In the meantime, I had one more thing to do. I called Fiona on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. I asked her if I could take her for coffee, just the two of us. She said of course. We met at a Tim Hortons near her office in Mississauga, which was not glamorous, but it was ours. We'd had many important conversations in Tim Hortons over the years. I told her everything. She didn't speak for a long time after I finished. She had her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and she was staring at the table, and I could see her working through it the way she'd always processed hard things, methodically and quietly and with a face that didn't show you much until it did. "Are you sure?" she said finally. "About the dock, yes," I said. "About the paperwork, yes. About what he was planning, I can't prove what was in his head. But I can prove what he did." She looked up at me. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying, not quite. "How long?" "Since September, at least. Maybe longer." She put her hand over mine on the table. We sat there for a while. "What do you need from me?" she said. That was my daughter. That had always been my daughter. I told her what I needed. I needed her to say nothing to Spencer. Nothing changed at home, nothing tipped him off. And I needed her at that Thanksgiving table. She nodded. She said, "Okay." I drove back to Hamilton that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not exactly peace. Something more like clarity. The kind that comes when you've been carrying something heavy and you finally set it down in the right place. The Friday before Thanksgiving, Catherine Marsh filed the documentation with the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit in Hamilton. I had a meeting with 2 investigators on the Saturday morning. They were professional and serious, and they asked me very good questions. They reviewed everything I'd brought, the photographs, the measurements, the receipt, Ben Willette's report, the beneficiary paperwork, and by the end of that meeting they had enough to proceed. They told me they would be moving quickly. Thanksgiving Sunday at Fiona's house. I arrived at 11 in the morning. Spencer was at the counter slicing vegetables, and he looked up when I came in and said, "Roger. Good to see you, man. How's the cabin?" He smiled his smile. "Beautiful this time of year," I said. "You should get up there sometime." Something flickered in his expression, just a flash, gone as quickly as it came. "Yeah, for sure," he said. "Sometime." Callum ran into the kitchen and crashed into my legs, and I caught him and lifted him up even though my back reminded me that 64 is not 44. He smelled like shampoo and orange juice, and I held on to him for an extra second. Ruth and Glenn arrived at noon. June and Paul came shortly after. The house filled up with noise and movement, the way houses do on those days, football on in the background, something sweet baking, the specific smell of a turkey that's been in the oven since early morning. We sat down at 1:30. Spencer was at one end of the table. I was at the other. Fiona sat to my left. Callum was next to her, already making a fortress out of his dinner roll. Spencer picked up his wine glass and raised it. "I want to say something before we eat," he said. He was looking at me with that grin, easy, confident, carrying some private satisfaction that he thought no one else could read. To Roger. For always being there for this family. Even if the old man does need to leave the heavy lifting to the younger generation sometimes. There was polite laughter from Ruth and Glenn, who didn't understand the reference and probably thought it was some gentle family teasing. June caught my eye across the table, and I gave her the smallest nod. Everyone drank. Spencer set down his glass, satisfied. I set down mine. "Thank you, Spencer," I said. "Actually, while everyone's here together, there's something I want to share." I kept my voice level, conversational. The voice I used in 30 years of presenting structural assessments to people who didn't want to hear bad news. I had a chance to go up to the cabin in October. Did some maintenance work while I was there. Found a few things I wasn't expecting. Spencer's expression didn't change. "Oh yeah? The dock needed some work," I said. "Significant work. Some of the bracing underneath had been cut through. Deliberately, it looked like. I've got the photographs if anyone's interested. Along with the RCMP report." The word RCMP landed in the room with a weight of its own. I also discovered, I continued, that there'd been some changes made to my financial accounts. A beneficiary update I didn't authorize. Or, I signed it, but I was told it was something else entirely. I looked at Spencer directly for the first time. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit has been very helpful in sorting that out. The table was completely silent. Spencer's face had got a color that was not quite white. More like the gray you see in concrete that's lost its integrity, that particular shade that tells you the structure is already failing before anything visible has happened. "Roger," he started. "I don't think you need to say anything right now," I said, still calm, still even. "In fact, I'd strongly suggest you don't. Your lawyer will have more useful advice on that than I can give." Ruth made a small sound. Glenn put down his fork. Fiona reached across and took Callum's plate. "Hey, bud," she said quietly, "why don't you go watch some TV in the other room? I'll bring you dessert in there. But the turkey, I'll bring you a plate." She said it with a steadiness that I recognized. Carol's steadiness. The kind that doesn't waver because it can't afford to. Callum slid off his chair and padded out of the room without complaint, the way children sometimes sense that the adults need them elsewhere. Spencer pushed back from the table. His voice, when he found it, had a different quality, thinner, the confidence stripped out of it. "This is insane. You can't." 2 RCMP investigators came to my house on Saturday morning, I said. They were very thorough. I imagine you'll be hearing from them shortly if you haven't already. I picked up my fork. The turkey looks wonderful, Fiona. Your mother would have approved of that brine. Spencer left the table. He went upstairs. A few minutes later we heard him on the phone, voice raised, then quieter, then quiet altogether. Ruth was crying silently. Glenn sat with his hands flat on the table looking at nothing in particular. June reached across and put her hand on Ruth's arm. We ate Thanksgiving dinner. It was not the easiest meal I've ever sat through, but it was honest, and in some ways that made it the most honest family meal I'd had in years. The RCMP executed a search warrant on Spencer's vehicle and home office the following Tuesday. The charges were laid in early December: fraud over $5,000, mischief endangering life, and, after the investigators had done their work and found 2 additional communications on Spencer's phone that I hadn't known about, criminal harassment. The fraud charge related to the beneficiary paperwork. The mischief charge related to the doc. The harassment charge was something I hadn't known was coming, which was a kind of gift. Fiona filed for divorce in January. She and Callum are staying in the Mississauga house. Spencer's parents helped with the legal costs in a way that I think reflected genuine remorse on their part rather than tactical calculation. Ruth called me in February to apologize. We talked for a long time. She deserved better from her son than she'd gotten, and she knew it. I had the dock properly repaired in spring, new pressure-treated lumber, new hardware, new cross-bracing, built to the load specifications I'd used on every project in my career. I stood on it the first weekend in May and looked out at the lake, and I thought about the 30 years I'd spent learning how things are built and why they fail. And I thought about Spencer's face at that Thanksgiving table. That concrete gray color. The moment when the confidence collapsed and what was underneath it was visible. A structure is only as strong as what you can't see. The hidden joids. The load-bearing elements that nobody looks at because they assume someone competent has taken care of them. I'd spent my career looking at those things. Looking carefully at what others overlooked. Spencer made the mistake of assuming that because I was older, because I moved more slowly, because I'd retired and stepped back and stopped being visible, that I'd stopped paying attention. He was wrong about that. Experience doesn't retire. It just gets quieter about what it knows. Fiona and Callum came up to the cabin in July, just the 3 of us. We took the canoe out in the morning and fished off the dock in the afternoon and made a fire after dark, and Callum fell asleep in my lap before the flames were halfway down. I sat there listening to the lake and the bush and the sound of my grandson breathing, and I thought, this is what I have. This is what he was trying to take. He didn't get it. I sold the registered account, the one he'd tried to redirect, and put the proceeds into a trust for Callum's education. $382,000, sitting in an account that Spencer Holt will never touch, that will one day pay for something that will outlast all of this by decades. I thought Carol would have liked that very much. I thought, slow, careful, and absolutely certain. That's how you build something that lasts. That's how you protect it, too.